And all right,
All right, are we ready?
yep, we are going live right now.
All right.
Yep.
So, hello everyone, and I want to say thank you for inviting me. And I'm Louis Malmadrona. You can see that on my screen. I'm trying to turn off the sound on my cell phone so that it doesn't ring while we're talking. And I'm streaming to you from the middle of Maine, where it snowed today, and uh, other crazy things, of course, are happening. But so I'm going to talk to you today. We're going to play with indigenous ideas and contemporary scientific ideas. And we're going to go back and forth. And I'm going to I'm going to present in the framework of the two modalities. So from the indigenous side, I'm going to tell you stories. And from the other side, I'm going to show you PowerPoints. And we're going to go back and forth and try and have some fun with both of these ways of thinking. So, so I want to start with my favorite character, Coyote. Coyote, you know, I didn't really want to have Coyote as a muse. I tried to get Bear, but no bears ever came around me. I tried to get Cougar. I couldn't find any cougars. And I tried to get tigers, but they don't live in North America. So the only creature that kept coming everywhere that I showed up was Coyote, who howled. And people would say, that's never happened before. And I said, well, I've never been here before. So, so Coyote appears to be my friend, whether I want him or not. And Coyote's been around since the world was born. He's a supernatural being, or she's a supernatural being, because Coyote can be all genders. Coyote is everything and everyone, all rolled into one. So whatever you want Coyote to be, Coyote will be. And you know, when the world was new, Coyote was a cousin to humans, and people and animals lived together and talked together. And back in the day, Coyote loved the night, and he would sit and stare at the stars every chance he got. And before long, he noticed one particular beautiful star, and he really liked that star. And he watched that star every night, and he talked to her for hours at a time. And he pretty soon he fell in love with that star. And the more he talked to the star, the more he loved her, and the more he wanted her to say something, to just speak back. But she was silent. Night after night, she said nothing. And she watched him, you know, down on the earth as she slid back and forth across the black velvet of the sky on her nightly journeys. But he kept talking to her and she never talked back to him. And you can imagine what happened. This drove poor Coyote crazy. And every night he noticed that as she passed across the sky, she came really close to a particularly high mountain. And that gave Coyote an idea. And whenever Coyote has an idea, it's dangerous. That's a bad thing, generally speaking. And so Coyote decided to go to that mountaintop. It was a long way. Wow. Was he ever tired by the time he reached the place where she passed every night? He needed to rest, but he was afraid to close his eyes, afraid he would miss the star crossing by. So he sat and he waited for the sky to turn dark. When she finally appeared, he realized that the whole thing was worthwhile. He almost fainted for joy when he saw her come really close. Oh my God, she was even more beautiful than he could have ever imagined as she danced across the sky with the other stars. So he waited. And you can imagine his heart was nearly jumping out of his mouth. But he said nothing. And this beautiful star danced closer and closer to where he stood. And he reached up with his paw to grab her hand, but he couldn't quite touch her. Please reach down and take my hand so I can dance with you, he said. And she heard him and she did what he asked. Beautiful star lowered her lovely hand until she touched Coyote's paw. And then she threw him up, and slowly, slowly they danced away from the mountaintop. They danced higher and higher until Coyote got dizzy and he got scared. And it was cold and quiet. None of the star people spoke. They just danced in silence. And Coyote thought, I might have made a mistake here. And he asked the stars to take him home, but no one answered him. And when they were at the very top of the sky, and he couldn't even see the distant mountaintop, beautiful star let go of his paw, and he fell down and down and down. And when he hit the earth, he made a big hole, and his blood turned to water by the cold, and he filled the hole. It's, nowadays we call it Crater Lake. And nowadays, every time you hear a coyote howling at the stars at night, remember this story and know that he is scolding beautiful star for letting him go, for letting him drop down, for letting him fall to earth and go kablam. And so that's how we start. That we all want to touch the stars. And some of us will do anything to get there. And sometimes the consequences are more than we realized. But we are in a relationship with the world around us. And so we're going to see if I know how to open a slide set from this platform, this webinar, and I might not. So if we don't open it, well, who cares? I'll just keep talking and I'll tell you what it said. So I've never used this platform before. So,
Um, if you go to the share content button
hmm,
at the bottom of the screen, I think it'll let you like share a window, kind of like Zoom does.
yeah, it was too complicated.
It's okay.
So, you know what? I'm just going to talk
Okay.
because I'm mostly going to tell stories because it's so not like Zoom that I can't figure it out on this on this on the fly, so to speak. So 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 what can we learn from Indigenous people that relates to this story? And that is that individuals do not exist, that we are social brains, and that we are not our brains. There's a marvelous book called You Are Not Your Brain, which I really recommend. And it talks about how we exist in the relationships between ourselves. And so, Indigenous knowledge is a story of community and belongingness. And in contemporary science, it relates to the social brain hypothesis, which says that human brains are as big as they are so that we can think about and manage our relationships with other people. And so, what's really important are relationships, community, belonging. And earlier today, I learned that um, a lot of what I'm talking about is interrelationships. So we talk about client centered medicine, but what we really want to talk about is interpersonal medicine. And brains are expensive to maintain. So, for example, the adult brain, human brain, weighs about 2% of our body weight, but it consumes about 20% of our total energy intake. And the other thing that's really interesting is called the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis. And it turns out that primates, including humans, are the only species that use tactical deception and coalition formation as strategies for social control, for climbing the social hierarchy, for getting what we want. And that takes a big brain. So our big brain evolved for relationship. And indigenous people knew that it's all about relationship and that we manage relationship through stories. And so in this social brain idea, there's four main ideas that that of course that our brain size depends on prenatal maternal resources. But what's really interesting is that brain growth is pretty much done. It's virtually done by birth, and the rest of it is done by the end of breastfeeding. But um, it still needs a lot of effort to maintain it. And primates need more brain than anyone else because of the higher number of relationships. So relationship is everything. And that's what indigenous people know. So our brains evolved to manage our social relationships. And it turns out that humans can manage well about 150 relationships. Monkeys, chimpanzees, only about 25. And it's a linear relationship between brain size and the number of relationships that we can manage. So we need each other to survive, and we need each other to thrive. This need for belonging is huge. And this is the lesson from indigenous culture, is that it's about the unit of study for mental health and well-being as the community or the family and not the individual. And and um, so one of the things that we'll see as we look at some more indigenous stories is the emphasis on altruism, on the emphasis on connectedness with each other. And, in order to continue to survive as a species or a culture, we need each other. We can't change ourselves without changing each other. And behavior change does not occur at the level of the individual, it occurs at the level of the group. And so we influence others to make changes, and it's not possible to know where our influence ends, that it travels outward. And so it's complicated, the world. It's a complex system. And indigenous people knew that. They have stories that explain that every action affects everyone else around us. We say mitakuyasan, which means to all our relations. And it means that we are connected in a network, in a spider web of all of our relationships. And so, time for another story. And this is a story from Western New York. It's a story that people told to their children for many winters in the past. And and it originated in a Mohawk village along the Oswego River. And one day, hunters discovered the tracks of a giant bear. And they saw those tracks many times. And sometimes the tracks would circle the village. And then game began to disappear from the forest. And they knew that the giant bear was killing all of their game. And because the game was becoming scarce, famine came to them. The meat racks were empty. The people were hungry. They faced starvation. The head chief said, "We have to kill off this giant bear who is causing all of our trouble." So warriors went out in search of the bear. And he wasn't that hard to find. They just followed his tracks in the snow. And they followed his tracks for many days. And they finally came upon this huge bear. And they fired all their arrows at this huge bear. But to their surprise and dismay, the arrows just bounced off the thick skin of the bear. Many broken arrows fell from his tough skin. And that bear got really angry at them. And he turned and he charged, and the hunters fled, but some of them were overtaken and some of them were killed by that bear, by that angry bear. And a couple escaped and they came back to the village to tell the sad story. And they told what happened to the war party. And war party after war party set out to destroy that bear, but they always failed. There were many battles between the bear and the warriors. Many warriors died, and as time went on, more and more deer vanished from the forest, and the meat smoking racks were empty. People became very thin from lack. Starvation caused many of them to become sick. They were scared, and their hungry bodies crept close to the fire at night. Everyone feared that giant bear. And they feared leaving their village because they could hear in the darkness of the forest the sounds of the great bear. But one night, three brothers had a strange dream. On three successive nights, they had the same dream. They dreamed that they tracked down and killed the great bear. And they said, that dream must be true. So they got their weapons and a little bit of food and they set out after that bear. And in a while, they came upon the tracks. And they followed the tracks. They were ready with their arrows. For many moons, they followed the tracks of that bear across the earth. And the tracks led them to the end of the world. And looking forward, they saw that giant bear leap from the earth into the heavens. And they followed him to the jumping off place. And without hesitation, they jumped. And they followed that bear into the sky. And there in the heavens, you can see them chasing the bear during the winter nights. And in the fall of the year, when the bear gets ready for the winter, the three hunters get close enough to shoot their arrows into into his body. And his dripping blood turns the autumn leaves red and yellow. But you didn't know how the leaves got to be red and yellow. But he always manages to escape. For a time after being wounded, he is invisible, but then he reappears. So when the people see what we call the Big Dipper in the sky, they say, "Look, those three hunters, they're still chasing that big bear." And they haven't stopped yet. And so there's a continuity here. There's a never-ending story. There's this bear that we chase, and it never goes away. That we're always connected, we're always present in a universe, that we can't escape this world. And in Indigenous thought, the world is not out there independent from us, and we're not independent from the world, that we and the world co-create each other. And this is consistent with contemporary neuroscience. It's called the enactment theory of cognitive science, that we and the world co-create each other. And one of the examples of this is color vision, that the colors are created in interaction with the world by us, and that insects see radically different colors. It's hard to imagine what they see. They're so different. So, Indigenous thought, paying attention is good for you. And the world is constantly changing. And if we pay attention to the world, we see its changes. And I personally have seen mountains get up and walk and move themselves. And I've been trained to try and argue with myself that that didn't happen. I'm just imagining it. But from my Indigenous side, I'm like, no, dude, you saw that mountain get up and walk. That's real. And so paying attention matters. And paying close attention to what's going on around us, within us, and between us on a regular basis is really important. This is Indigenous knowledge. And so if we want new habits, we should work with our habitats. So if we want to change, we need to change our environment. We need to change the world in which we find ourselves, because that world manages us. That world modulates us. That world modifies us. That world shapes us. So if you want a different experience, then we have to change our habitat. That changing our habitat is a much more effective way of changing ourselves than trying to change ourselves. Because in the Indigenous worldview, the self does not exist. It arises spontaneously as an emergent property when needed to manage an intention, a context, a need, a purpose, and then it dissimulates. It breaks down, it disappears. And where does it come from? It comes from the storehouse of stories that we carry. It comes from all the stories that live within us. And and so we have considerable power to shape our habitats for purposes beyond our basic needs, unlike other creatures who focus entirely on their basic needs. So, the most effective way to produce behavior change is not about willpower, but about shaping our environments to be more aligned with our goals and values, changing the environment in which we live. And so, so we have this collective self-awareness, and and we can reflect upon our relationships. And how do we manage all this information? Through stories. Only through stories can we create and share these imagined worlds of our sensory experiences. And to negotiate our social relationships, we create a story about the social world. And we have this big brain designed to do that. which is really pretty cool. And so we can talk about narrative competence, which is this idea that through teaching story making, we can teach the brain to make new connections. And and that it's critical that we understand this dimension in which the possible takes place, which could be a parallel universe. But even so, whether it's experienced in a dream or a vision, we're talking about an experience that happened. And and this brings us to the idea of the of all experience being granted ontological validity. All experience is true experience. We may not understand it. We may not understand the dimension in which it took place, but that doesn't mean it's not real. And I have an example of that for you. This is a story about a child who came from beneath the earth. Now, you don't see that every day. And it's a Mi'kmaq story. And the Mi'kmaqs live in the world in Maine, and east of Maine, and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And all Mi'kmaq stories begin with out in the forest, all by themselves. An old man and an old woman are living, or some variation of that. They all take place out in the forest. The forest is away from us. The forest is the place where mysteries take place. The forest is the place of magic. And they hear a noise. It sounds like someone's knocking, beating on a birch bark drum. And the old woman wonders, where's this coming from? And they look everywhere. They look inside their wigwam and they look outside their wigwam. And after a while, they figure out that it's coming from underground. Wow. And so they begin to dig. You know, they dig away the ground, and under the earth, they find a small boy. Now, you don't see that every day. And so they take him home and they wash the dirt from him and they make him clothes and they feed him, even though they're very poor and it's hard to hunt. They're happy to be doing this for the little boy because he came to them from inside the earth. And after a while, it shows that they've been feeding him because he grows. And like many spiritual beings, he grows very fast. There's so many stories of magical babies who grow very fast. And soon he is hunting for them. Soon he is helping them. Soon he is fishing for them. And one day he goes out to fish, and when he comes back, he says, oh, by the way, I caught a whale. Well, that doesn't happen every day. And so the old man and the old woman run down to the shore. And there is a whale. There it is on the shore with a large pile of oysters. So they all sit down, all three of them. And the old man takes out his knife, and the old woman takes out his knife, and the boy who caught the whale takes out his knife, and they have a feast on these very big oysters. Yum. I love oysters. I love shucking oysters and eating them. This is just a delicious story to me. And all of a sudden, the woman stands up. She needs to dance. She begins to move. She dances around those oysters, back and forth, winding around and around and around them, faster and faster. The dance fills her with something. She has the power within her. And one of those oysters begins to change its shape. It begins to grow. It grows high, it grows wide. It fills the whole space of a whale. 30 widths of elbows placed on. That's how Mi'kmaq measure distance. Musniki Kajik is how they say it. And that oyster is shaping itself into a whale from that dance. And pretty soon, the whale is lying there before another whale, a whale made from an oyster. And the old man begins to butcher it. And the old woman helps him. And the boy from out of the ground helps them. For days they slice up and dry whale meat, setting it to freeze, because that's what people did in those days in the winter. They just put their meat in a safe place to freeze. They had outdoor refrigeration. And they ate whale blubber and rejoiced. There was enough food for the winter. Now, sadly, sometime in the winter, the old woman died, and the old man washed her body and wrapped her in a birch bark shroud and put her knife inside it with her in her dish. And then he said to the boy who came out of the earth, come. And they put her body on a toboggan and they carried it to the place where the dead ones were buried. And when spring came, he came back to visit her, took the bark sheet away from her face. He looked, saw her once more, and he was happy. And he began to dance. And so that's a story that speaks to our relationship with the universe and with death and life and rebirth and with the magic that happens along the way. And so it's because of our capacity to do story that we can understand all this. And we don't necessarily understand it. We can be aware of it. We can know it without knowing how we know it. And just briefly, I want to tell you a little bit about story brain. And story brain was discovered by a fellow named Rakel at Washington University in St. Louis, who was looking at MRI scans of people who were told to do nothing. And usually these scans were compared to those of people who were told to do something like arithmetic or multiplication or whatever. And he realized that there was a similarity and that it was this doing nothing was a whole brain phenomena. And he called it the default mode network. It's what we do when we're not doing anything. And then he did a little bit of clinical phenomenology. He asked people what they were doing when they weren't doing anything. And it turned out that what people were doing was making up stories about other people in their lives, about the social situations in which they found themselves. And and there are these brain areas that are involved in doing this. And of course, Indigenous people didn't need to know the names of the brain areas. They just knew that we manage the world through story. And now we know about the brain and we talk about story brain or social brain or default mode network. And we know that the precuneus and the parietal lobe is important. And we know that the posterior cingulate gyrus is important, the midline areas. And we know that the medial prefrontal cortex is important. And all of these things support our spontaneous mental activity, our streams of thoughts, our episodic memories, our review of stories, our running of social simulations, because that's what we do. And there's some other areas that are important. The amygdala patches emotions to us. The insula is important. The superior temporal sulcus is important. And there's an app, uh, Cold Harbor. It's called 3D Brain App. And I really recommend it. I get no kickbacks if you get it. But you can, whenever you hear a talk about brain regions, you can look for them And it makes so much more sense when you see them and can manipulate them in 3 dimensions. So the posterior cingulate cortex and the precuneus are really interesting because they continually gather information about the world around us and within us and alert us when something novel or interesting is happening so we can pay attention. That seems good. So it means that we're alert to changes in our environment and we notice them immediately. And we review our experience and knowledge and other sensory information to decide what they are. So our default practice is to scan the environment for change, for difference. And you might imagine that difficulties could arise if you scan too much or too little, or if you can't make sense of what's changed. And maybe that's the definition of anxiety, is the feeling of not having made meaning of what's going on. So I want to tell you another story. And this is a story from the Southwest, from Cochiti Pueblo. And in those days, on the mesa lived Grandfather Coyote. He had a little drum, and he used to sit above the road and beat the drum and sing a song, which went to say, look out, Coyote is going to hit you on the back, on the back. And he just sang that over and over and over, and it was probably got to be really boring. And whenever the prairie dogs heard him singing, they would come running to him and they would say, wow, you really sing beautifully. And they would tease him and step in time to the song. And they would plead him to sing again, even when he paused to rest. Sing again, Grandfather Coyote. It's such fun to dance to your song. One day, Skunk ran into the prairie dog village. Skunk told the little prairie dogs, Old Coyote is dead. They must come and see. Prairie dogs thought this could be good news if it was true, so they ran out to see for themselves. And there was Old Coyote lying stiff on the ground. Let's sing and dance because he's dead and he can't bother us anymore, they said. So they began to dance around Old Coyote and to sing. Look out, Coyote is going to hit you on the back, on the back. Suddenly, Old Coyote jumped up and began to strike down those prairie dogs. And Skunk caught them as he hit each one. Skunk caught them. And when there were no more prairie dogs left, Old Coyote sat back thinking what a fine meal of prairie dogs he would have. But Skunk was nowhere to be seen, and he ran off with all the prairie dogs. And that's how it happened. That Old Coyote outwitted himself. And that can happen. We can be too tricky. We can outwit ourselves. And sometimes that happens, when the prefrontal cortex isn't working quite right. We might find ourselves jumping up and running from imaginary tigers that don't exist. And it reminds me of something that Mark Twain said. He said, now that I'm old, I've lived through countless disasters, most of which never happened. And so brains, selves, minds, awareness, they're very interesting things. And indigenous thinkers knew that mind is a verb and not a noun, that what exists is awareness. And when awareness focuses on an object in the external world with intentionality, a self is assembled to manage the purpose of that focus. And when the purpose is completed, when the intention is done, the self dissembles itself and returns to a sort of Euroboric state of potentiality. And where do these selves live? The Lakota say that they live in a swarm around us, around our bodies, called the Naki. And all of these stories swarm around us and make us who we are. And each story contains a spark of the being who told that story. And so stories are all we have. As Leslie Marmo Silko, the author of Ceremony, said, stories are all we have to protect us from sickness, darkness, and disease. It's all about the story. And so within story brain, the posterior cingulate cortex helps us to tell the correct social story. So it helps us to figure out what story will work best for the audience that we encounter in front of us. Helps us to retrieve all this elaborate information from personal experience. And it contributes visual-spatial imagery to the story. And that's pretty cool. So the idea is that our brains were formed from the outside in. And there's considerable neuroscience literature to support this. One of my favorite philosophers of neuroscience is Evan Thompson. So I refer you to his books and writings to back this up. But what's important for us is that these ideas are indigenous ideas, as well as newly arrived at European ideas. And so one could say that these ideas are ancient and that the notion of working with story in the context of community through ceremony and ritual, through the telling of stories, through imagery, through what we now called guided visualization, but probably didn't have a name once upon a time, except that one elder translated it to me as putting them to sleep so that they're not asleep, but dreaming like they are asleep. It seemed like a good definition. And so what we're talking about is bringing indigenous ideas about mind, mental health, and wellness into the present. And we can do that best by interacting with the stories, like the ones I've been telling you, and by understanding that we're not meant to, to know things by ourselves, that we need each other, and that we need small enough groups of each other that we can have deep, intense interpersonal relationships. Because these are what change people. It's not information that changes people, but it's deep, connected, interpersonal experiences. And we have to figure out through some sort of social engineering process how to create that. So, time for another story. And I already told you that I'm fond of Coyote. He's one of my friends. And he likes to believe that he's a powerful spirit. And it's true, he has defeated monsters and stolen fire for the people and moved mountains and traveled to distant places and even off of the earth and just amazing experiences. But he felt like there was something missing from his life. And what's interesting about this, because it makes me wonder if the story was contaminated by European thought, because this notion that there's something missing from our lives is a very capitalistic notion. the idea that we need more and more and more fulfillment. But anyway, Coyote is a little bit of a glutton no matter where or when or what, so maybe it doesn't pertain to him. And so he wanted some thrill that he had never experienced before, because you can imagine that if you're a supernatural sacred being and you live forever and you can't be killed, really, that you might have done it all, and he had, and and there was nothing on the earth, no adventure, no pleasure that he hadn't experienced. And he wanted something more, something new, something further. And so he traveled across the world looking for that something missing. He walked across all of the known lands in search of that thing that would complete him. He traveled in the lands of the cold white north and he didn't find anything. He traveled the Great Plains, but he couldn't find anything. He climbed over the mountains, but he couldn't find anything. And after years of looking, he decided to give up looking. I must have experienced everything this world has to offer, he said. And he let out a mournful howl at the sky. Arr! Something like that. And and hearing his sadness, a star fell from its place in the heavens and streaked across the darkness. And one by one, the stars began to fall from the sky and put on the most beautiful dance. He wanted to join them. He wanted to dance in the night sky all across the world. Wow, that would be a pleasure fit for someone of his status. And on the next night, he went back to the same place and he howled his same sorrowful tune. And begged the stars to let him dance with them. And he watched in amazement as they jumped across the black sky, dancing as they raced through the air. And he thought if he howled loud enough, he could get one of them to come so close that he might jump on it and fly with the star. So night after night, he came back and he did the same thing. And he asked to join their dance. He did this for 3 nights, and finally the brightest star answered him. And she said, "This is not a place for coyotes. This is a world not like yours, and you cannot dance with us. You must stay in your place." Coyote was not very good at staying in his place. So every night he came back to the same spot and he howled at the sky and he begged the stars to take them in their dance across the heavens. And this went on for quite some time until the brightest star in the sky spoke again to Coyote, and she said, You don't listen to my warnings, and you've not stopped asking to dance with us. You leave me no choice but to grant your request and take you into our world. At which point she came down from the heavens and she said, Jump on me from the top of the highest mountains. And so he climbed to the top of the highest mountain and he tried to jump on the star as it zoomed past at full speed. But he didn't time his jump very well, and he only managed to take hold of the star's tail as it danced through the sky. And swept up into the black night, he looked down upon the earth, and the earth began to move at an incredible speed beneath his feet. He did his best. He did his best to hold on to the star's tail as it flew about the heavens, but the star's tail began to fade, and he lost his grip, and he tumbled out of the sky, and the sky kept dancing all night long. As he fell, the bright star said, Coyote, I warned you that this was not a good place for you. Your arrogance and self-importance blinded you, and now you will pay the price. And so he plunged down to the ground, and his magical powers were knocked out of him, and he was condemned to live throughout the rest of existence as an ordinary coyote, howling at the moon at night in summer. The end. And it's a story that tells us much about our relationships with the world, with nature, all those things around us. So, so we need each other, is the bottom line. We need to be more group-like than individual-like. We need to find belonging with each other. We need to practice and create ceremonies and rituals to enhance, enliven, and enrich each other. We need to support each other through stories, through songs, through dancing, whatever way works, through drumming, and and to feel included, to make friends, to find shelter, work, relationship, to make positive stories about life, and to reach out to those people who are unable to connect socially because they exist, and to draw them in to our lives. And um, so this is a little bit about the Indigenous paradigm of thought, and I hope you'll play with the stories and wonder what they mean. I have just a little bit more time remaining and not enough time to tell you a long story, but to tell you the story that a story of Coyote. Coyote was trying to learn to shapeshift because he'd seen birds shapeshifting and he tried to manipulate them into teaching him. And reluctantly they did. But one day he forgot to unshift and he went back to his den thinking he was a coyote when he was really a rabbit. And his children tore him limb from limb and ate him. And so the moral of that story is know your audience and know what shape you happen to be in. And there's I think that people sometimes get caught up in the pageantry of ceremony without understanding the philosophy that underlies it. And so what I wanted to do tonight was to give you a little bit of a sense of the philosophy that underlies it, and and this notion of social brain, which is present in contemporary neuroscience as well, and and the idea that we are created from the outside in. So the best way to change is to change our surroundings, to change our social environment. That social engineering is more effective than individual engineering. And to understand that the group is larger than the individual, and that we're never separate from the context in which we find ourselves, that we're always embodied in the land, that we're always local, never universal. So that whether we're dreaming, visioning, thinking, imagining, we're always doing so on the land, in the context in which we find ourselves. And as one elder told me from Australia, in Australia, there's 405 creation stories. They're all different and they're all true. They're all true in the place where they're told by the people who tell them. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that we're local beings, that, that they're in indigenous thought. would teach us that there's no universals, that we have to ground ourselves in the land upon which we find us and make sense of our lives in the context of that land. So I think my time is up. I hope I piqued your curiosity about some things. And I don't know how to get back to the screen. This WebEx is very difficult for me, having lived my life on Zoom. So, anyway, that is all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really, really insightful. Thank you.